today because stuff is not actually. All right, so first you should have put this. Oh, sorry, doesn't matter. I forgot to put. If if I put all this data into Desmos or the calculator, we would have got some line that looks like this. This zoomed in, so you can see that this line best fits this data, and then the first question asked you to round to 1 decimal place. So in this, rounding to 1 decimal place would have been y equals point. This actually would have rounded this up. 1. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. Yeah, sorry. 0.6 x plus 9.8. Now, moving forward, yes, your question, the first question asks you to round to the first decimal place. All of the others, you should have been using all of the decimals, either algebraically or graphically, and I'm going to show that. So in this next one, using this, all the decimals, the 10-month-old girl, the 10-month would be in X. So this would be me showing my work. This is how I'm going to do this in Desmos. Put X equals 10 in Desmos and find where those two lines cross. So 16.3 was the correct answer. That was the most accurate. So if you put, what did everyone else put? 15.8? That's not as accurate because you're using the equation with less amount of decimals. So you want the most accurate, which would be the equation itself has all the decimals in it. So this is the most accurate.
How would you get my question?
We have to keep going though. Second guessing yourself.
Wait, yeah, that's what I did.
Second guessing yourself is the only way to go down with
Right here. You told me I was wrong. You told me I was wrong.
But listen, I did not mark you wrong if you put 15.8 this time. So if you do that on the project, it will be wrong. Why is it say not?
Because it's
Because it's not.
Does that
Need choice.
No, she didn't take switch off, but no, you mistake. Isn't this a form?
Okay. Many of you did not put your labels. That's why you missed points. So make sure you are putting your labels if it says to label. Actually put your labels even if it doesn't say to label. By hand, you would have used as many decimals as possible. So let me write this equation down. So let's say you use 3 or more makes this the most accurate. So 6.4, I'll round that to 5. X plus 9.833. And then if I were to calculate that either in the calculator or in Desmos. You're gonna get a more accurate answer. So 3 or more decimals as you're solving. The question just set to round to 1 decimal place. And because it didn't say continue using all of the decimals, which is why I gave you all of the credit, unless you missed work or something like that. Okay, questions on that first one? the 16.26, 27, 3. Yeah, so 16.26, 16.3, 16 point. If you wrote more decimals, all of those were fine. And then we were looking for pounds. So you would have either shown this or shown this to do your work. And then got one of those answers. Okay, the next question is the same, except you had to change 5 years to months. So you should have shown me how you got 60.
Wait, let's go. So for the problem above, if I'm solving it with the equation and decimals like you just did, I would always round it to the nearest hundredth.
1,000. The third place is the 1,000.
So always the third place when I'm doing that problem.
If you're doing it algebraically or in the calculator or Desmos, it has all the decimals, so you can just look at where they cross.
Show you what 5 times 12 is.
So you probably missed points, yes. And then where those two lines cross would be at 48.45, 48.5 pounds. One second, guess what's up. And then for the last one, how old will a girl be in months if she weighs more than 45? So if you were using Desmos, you would type in 45, but then I'm gonna have you look at something else. So this is exactly at 45. So I would want to go as close as 45 as I can get, a little bit over. So I could go 54.64, and that would be a little bit over, just so you see that. It would be somewhat close to this, so 54.7. Even though that doesn't round up, but that would be more than 45. If you went up to 55, that was fine. And then I can show you that one, I'll break it as well. Was that gonna be your question?
Can we just put 45 in?
You can put 45, look at the decimal, and then go up a little bit. So like 55 would work, 54.7 would work.
So we just go up like point.
You need to be super close. So I accepted 54.64 up to 55.
So we could use 45.8.
No. So if you were using this, doing this by hand, you would change this to 45 points. So between 46 is probably too much, so maybe between 45.1 and 0.5. More than that would be less accurate. And then it also depends on what number you use. So if you use 45.5, that's gonna give you a different number than 45.1. And that last one was looking for months, so if you put pounds, you put the wrong label. Questions on any of that? that may have just been, I overlooked though. The 60 was way too much. Okay. So then your projects, you're gonna get into 6 groups of 3 and 2 groups of 2. So before you get into your groups, I'm gonna show you what the project is, but I need 2 volunteers. Well, 3. So you guys are gonna show what everyone else is going to be doing. Okay. So you guys are gonna collect data on how many pennies it takes to break a spaghetti noodle. Please don't eat or put the spaghetti noodles in your mouth. They've been on the floor and people's hands.
To start that.
This is your project. So every group is gonna get a plastic bag. You're gonna look at your project sheet to see how many spaghetti noodles you need, and everyone's gonna get a cup of pennies or multiple if you need it. Who wants to be the holder? Who wants to be the penny? So you're gonna thread the spaghetti noodle through the bag and you're gonna hold it at the very ends. If you're sitting at a desk, you don't want the bag to ever touch the table, or if you're elsewhere, you can also go into the hallway, you don't want it touching the floor. Okay, and then you're gonna drop those in one by one and count how many pennies it takes to break them. Make sure you're only holding the ends and that the bag is in the middle. One. You have to put them in one at a time. Some of the noodles are stronger than others.
And that's one of the penny. Watch this.
Is it big?
That's strong.
It is
All the
bending.
other ones
It's
are
like-
strong enough.
So these are angel hair. I did it with spaghetti my first year and that took forever.
Oh, spaghetti's big.
Forty. Okay, so keeping that in mind, once you get into your group, I'm gonna give you a piece of paper, you're gonna read through the directions, and you're gonna make a prediction. After you have made that prediction, then one person from your group is going to come get supplies. And you guys can start collecting data and then answering your questions. You can use Desmos or your calculator. Everything else needs to be put away. So go ahead and get into your groups.